Hi, I'm Rusty Dornan from the Kaufman Fellows Academy, and we are very lucky today to welcome Brad Feld, the instructor and author of Venture Deals, after his mishap last week on a bicycle. But he's looking pretty good. It looks like there are no visible marks on it. Brad, you want to just let everybody, there's been some concern in the class on how you're doing. You want to let us know how you're doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. I had a bike accident heading into work, and I don't remember what happened, and I have about 60 minutes missing from both being unconscious and then not knowing what was happening. Probably a little bit of amnesia around the accident. But looks like I wasn't hit. Looks like it was my fault, and just landed on my head. I'm doing fine though. I am a little behind on the Ask Brad comments. I'm behind kind of on everything as I took Thursday, Friday off and took most of the weekend off, so I'll get caught up on that. So thanks for patience on that. But for those of you that expressed some concern, I got a couple of notes. Thank you.
Great. We have our first question as a note of just saying, first of all, I wish you quick recovery. I was glad to read that you were not injured too seriously. Can you share any pre-money valuation benchmarks for companies in the seed round? Pre-product, but very strong team. Beta version, a few pilot customers. I think this is the second half. Hang on. If you have to choose between either having a celebrity expert, social proof, or initial client traction, what would you personally go for? What factor is potentially influencing a startup's valuation more at seed stage?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. I'd always go for real momentum with customers, especially paying customers. Celebrity investor is nice, but I think it's probably in a lot of cases overrated, especially if you have the celebrity investor, but then you don't actually have execution behind it. So ultimately, you're going to have execution. It's also not an either or. I mean, if you're in a position where you're having good execution with the business, good momentum with customers, your chance of attracting a well-known investor is higher. In terms of pre-money valuation, the historical norms don't change much. There are some bumps up and down depending on the market, and we're definitely in a good market right now in terms of how things are working for the entrepreneur. So it's definitely a seller's market, not a buyer's market. If you view the entrepreneur as the seller of new equity and the investor as the buyer of new equity, typically for a seed round pre-product, you tend to see dilution of between 10% and 33%. I know that's a wide range, but it does have some dependency on how much you're raising as to how much dilution you end up taking. The normal sort of pre-money valuations for companies, and I'll focus on tech companies here for a sec, but then I'll talk about other types of companies. But for tech companies, you'll tend to see a valuation somewhere between $2 million pre-money and $5 million pre-money. You rarely see below $2 million pre-money. Sometimes you do, but very rarely. And you also sometimes see evaluations above $5 million pre-money, but very rarely. And again, that if you're raising $500,000, the outside valuation of $5 million, you might take 10% dilution. The inside valuation of $2 million, you'd end up taking 500 over 2.5 million. That'd be 20% dilution. But if you raised $1 million at $2 million, you might end up with 33% dilution. So that's what I mean by those types of numbers. I have found in some other areas that the pre-money valuations tend to be lower. So I've done a bunch of angel investments in natural food companies, and I found that the pre-money valuations in those companies have drifted down as much as $1 million pre. One of the challenges with seed investments, and it's something to be thoughtful of as the entrepreneur, is a really good investor or seed investor is not going to want to take too much ownership too early. You want the entrepreneurs to have a healthy stake. So when you have a seed investor showing up asking for 50% of the company, you should be wary. And you should be especially wary that that may not be an experienced seed investor or may not be somebody who actually understands the dynamics of being an early stage investor.
Okay, I also want to caution the folks that are putting in questions. It's better if you keep it to one paragraph, because sometimes if you're trying to do one question in 3 different boxes, it gets confusing if it's a continuation or a different question. Just a suggestion there. You also suggest, Brad, not asking a VC to sign an NDA. What if the founder has signed an NDA with a client or supplier and can't talk about that contract without breaching the included NDA?
So 2 things. One is you should never expect an investor to sign an NDA, whether it's a VC or an angel investor. I've written a blog post about it in the past. I'm happy to. I'll try to remember to put it up. Let me just write myself a note to put it up on the message board. Hang on one second. NDA post. I'll put the blog post up about it so that people see it. But basically, investors generally can't sign NDAs. Institutional investors, VCs, can't sign NDAs for 2 reasons. One is they see so many different things that it's not possible for them to actually honor the NDA from the standpoint of what an NDA typically says. And all that signing the NDA does is set you up for a legal issue. And the second is that you actually, if you had to review the NDA as a venture firm, the overhead of just reviewing and signing and keeping track of NDAs would be ridiculous. So VCs tend to focus much more on reputational effect. And my advice to entrepreneurs in general around NDAs is don't share information that you feel is confidential in your first meeting. Just be thoughtful about what you're sharing until you get real engagement with the investor. The other comment, which I've talked about a lot, is I think entrepreneurs tend to overvalue a lot of information and believe, I've got to keep this secret, and somehow an NDA protects that. Well, in fact, an NDA doesn't really protect that. The last comment is a lot of lawyers will tell you, well, you have to get an NDA signed, and your lawyers are just giving you old and bad advice. This generally is true for angel investors as well, for almost the same reasons. And as an entrepreneur, you generally look pretty naive if you're asking a potential investor for an NDA. It's better just to be very thoughtful about what you're sharing in that first meeting. Make sure you're sharing substantive, impactful information, but not that totally secret stuff that you might have. This comes to the question, if you've signed an NDA with a customer, you can't share that specific data with the customer. There's 2 approaches, or with the investor, there's 2 approaches. One is you certainly can share the information if you don't refer to the company by name. So you have to be careful about how you share it and what the NDA says, but most of the time you don't want to share that information with an investor in the first meeting anyway, if it's information under NDA, other than in vague terms. If you become engaged with the investor at some point, you can often go back to the customer and say, I've got a conversation going on with an investor. I'd like, I have this NDA with you. I want permission to be able to share this information with the investor. Most customers will let you do that. If for some reason they don't, then you have a discussion with the investor, which is, I have an NDA with this customer that covers this. I can't share more information unless you enter into some kind of NDA. What can we do? And most of the time, investors will come up with a solution that's a pretty lightweight confidentiality agreement around that customer. They'll be satisfied. The punchline of all that is, don't overvalue. I get that the question was a very specific one around NDA that you've already signed with the customer, so you do have to be thoughtful and respect that. But don't overvalue what your information is confidential in terms of what you're sharing with investors. I think it's a very common mistake I see, especially at the very early stages. But at the same time, don't overshare information with that investor in the first meeting. Your goal is to get the next meeting. And so you want to share enough information with the investor, especially if it's via email or the telephone, to get them interested to want to go deeper with you.
Okay. In negotiating convertible note terms, which should I fight for, discount or cap? For example, $2 million cap or 20% discount?
I think a cap is probably, in some cases, more important, or I should say the other way. The higher cap is better for you. So in some cases, the discount matters less than the cap. Most of the time, you're going to have both, by the way. Most convertible notes are going to have a cap and a discount. And so your discount in a convertible note, a reasonable discount to be dealing with is probably a discount in the 20% range. You'll see discounts of as high as 30% and as low as 10%, but the market norm for a discount is usually around 20%. So I wouldn't fight too much over that 20%. I would then focus on what's your cap, because you recognize that your cap is essentially the value that that round is going to convert into. So, you know, if the person's coming with a $2 million cap, it's likely that the debt, the convertible debt, when you raise your next equity round, will convert at a $2 million valuation. In that scenario, your dilution, if you can get a $3 million cap, is going to be substantially lower. And then really all you have to do to get to the $3 million cap is have the financing clear the $3 million cap, you know, by at least a 20% discount.
Okay, for a tech company, how early should you hire a finance, accounting / HR person for your company? 10th versus 50th employee?
It varies on the company. Certainly by 50, you should have a strong finance person, probably a VP finance level person. A lot of 50-person companies have a VP finance level person and a VP of people. At 10 people, it's conceivable that you still have your financial activity outsourced to a part-time CFO or a part-time CFO firm. But I think once you start generating any sort of revenue and having any sort of customer activity, having a VP finance type person is very useful. A lot of people will hire, you know, a controller level person that potentially can grow into that VP finance. The mistake a lot of early stage companies make is the opposite. They hire too senior. So you hire a CFO level person who is actually not able to do or doesn't want to do the day-to-day accounting. So you want somebody who can do the day-to-day accounting but can also help you with financial modeling and can also grow into your business. I'd separate that role from the VP of people role, and your role there is either an HR person who's just doing hiring, and if you're hiring quickly, having an HR person on staff is pretty important, versus having somebody who's actually part of your leadership team that's responsible for people. And I'll also put a blog post up about that from a while ago. I wrote a post about the difference between a VP of HR and VP of people. And there's a number of cases where in a company that's growing very, very quickly, having somebody on your senior team who's responsible not just for recruiting and for sort of classical HR, but also for working with the leadership team and working with managers to help them with their team building is often quite a useful person relatively early on. You can have that, you know, HR person reporting to the VP Finance if you want, but if you go to a VP of People type model, you'll typically want that person to report directly to the CEO.
Okay. Next in your book, you suggest, hang on, I just lost that question. Hang on there. Nope, that question just, oh, here you go. In your book, you suggest for founders to wait for a term sheet from the VC. What about the valuation discussion? What is the best approach to that?
Yeah, so, and just before I launch into this, I feel a little fuzzy on my answer, so if I'm a little fuzzy or staticky, apologize. If there's follow-ups or I'm not very clear on something, just toss it up in the Ask Brad Feld section and I'll try to follow up. The challenge of most negotiations with a VC is most VCs are going to want to try to get a number from you before they toss out a number. However, fundamentally, it's really the VC's responsibility to come up with the valuation. There's two approaches, the bid-ask approach and then the reasonable approach. The bid-ask approach is the one where you know you're going to be in an ask situation with the VC and you really want the VC to toss out a number first. Most VCs, when they're in that scenario, will toss out a relatively low number to try to anchor you lower than where you're at in terms of your expectation. The reasonable valuation approach is to have a more open conversation, especially if you're not in your first round of valuation, but you're in your second round or your Series B, you know, around the expectations. I generally advise entrepreneurs to try to get the VC to put out the first number, and your best leverage in that conversation with the VC is to have multiple investors independent of each other, making offers for the company. So, if you have a VC who offers, let's say it's a second round, you've raised $1 million of seed money, and you've got some revenue, and your business is now, doing 100K of MRR, and you're growing at 10%, month over month. You've got a real SaaS-based business, and you're starting to grow. That's a business that probably has a valuation somewhere between, on a pre-money basis, $10 and $20 million. And it's going to depend a little bit on the type of business, the momentum, et cetera. And if you start with an expectation that you're going to raise money at a $25 or $30 million valuation on that kind of a business, and you say to a VC, I'm thinking a $30 million valuation, you're probably going to have a lot of people who pass because they think you're being unreasonable. If a VC offers a $10 million valuation for that type of business, it's on the low side, but it's not ridiculous. And your best leverage there is either going to be to say, here's what it's going to take to get the deal done, in which case you would come back with that, or to have a couple of different offers where you can go back to that VC that offered you 10 if you really want them and say, look, we've got 3 other offers. If you want the deal, you're going to have to be at least at a 20 million pre or whatever the number is. So recognize that you're in a negotiating dance, and there is no magic rule. And understanding how you negotiate and how the person you're negotiating against approaches things is actually quite useful. I'll use us as an example. We're pretty well known. It's easy to talk to other entrepreneurs about how we approach things. We tend to not be particularly big bid-ask players. So we don't bid low and then try to anchor and then have big swings and try to meet in the middle. We generally offer what we think is fair, and we'll move off of that, 10, 15, maybe 20%, in terms of the conversation. A lot of times we won't move that much. Sometimes we're just wrong. Sometimes, somebody says, well, what do you think this is worth? And we come with a valuation, and we're low, and a good entrepreneur doesn't get offended. A good entrepreneur comes back and says, you're really off on that. Here's what we're hearing from other people and from the market. Here's what our expectations were. And then we have to make a decision as to whether, we're wrong. We're happy to be wrong. Let's try again. So knowing your investor or potential investor and their approach is quite useful. But then also knowing yourself. If you're the kind of person who likes to negotiate a big spread and narrow down to the middle, that's one approach. If you're somebody who says, nope, this is what I feel good about and this is what I want, and I'm going to keep looking for the investor that offers me something in this range, being more forthright about what that is often an effective strategy.
Along the lines of valuations again, valuations, especially at the seed stage, are mostly black art. At which point is a deal too pricey for you guys?
Yeah, it varies. I would say for us at the seed stage, our kind of view is if you haven't raised any money or any meaningful money, once you get above about a $5 million valuation, it's probably too expensive for us. So if you look at the FG Angels deals that we've done, the vast majority of them are done. We've done now 30-something of them in the last year. Almost all of them are done at prices between 2 pre and 5 pre. We've had a few that have been above that, a couple that have sort of drifted up closer to 6, 7, 8, and we've done a few that were uncapped that, when the dust settles, will probably end up being higher than that. But those are the exceptions. So the norm for us is sort of in that sub-5 range. We don't have a valuation metric that we focus on for financings that we do where companies have already raised money. We have a different approach, which is if you've raised more than $3 million, we're not a good target for you. So an example of a company that we did, and again I'll post this up there, which has a huge amount of data in it, was the financing we did for Moz, or SEO Moz, several years ago. We did a financing there, and their pre-money valuation was, I think, $75 million, and the post was 90-something, which would be very high for us typically. But the company had only raised $1.1 million of money before we invested. So they raised very little capital, and they built a business that was doing about $1 million a month of MRR. at the point at which we invested. So Rand Fishkin, the CEO and the founder, put up a blog post that was really epic. He put up this sort of 5 or 6 page long post describing the whole negotiation, describing how it worked, showing all the numbers, showing a calendar of how it played out, showing all of his metrics for the business, and being very open and transparent about it. So for those of you that are curious about how a negotiation can go down and what those pricing characteristics can look like, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that post. And again, I'll put that up in the course notes.
You always talk, or people talk about having the dream of having those, multiple negotiations going on where you've got people sort of competing for you. How do you orchestrate the timing on that, though? I mean, how can you make it all happen sort of at the same time without upsetting one or turning another one off, that sort of thing? What's your advice on that?
Well, it's very challenging to do in general, but recognize that part of being a good negotiator is to not be emotional about the process. Your job is not to worry about how the other person is feeling and whatever histrionics they have. It's to control your own emotion and style in the context of negotiation. I will tell you, having been on the receiving end of many negotiations, some that turned out, ones that I got to closure with, whether they're investing in a company or selling a company or buying a company, and many that didn't. As long as I felt like the person on the other side of the table was being honest with me and being direct, I never have felt like I've never been upset with the person, even in situations where somebody else ended up getting a deal that we were negotiating for. So I think the key thing is never to lie in a negotiation. If you lie in a negotiation, the second you lie and you're caught, you've lost all credibility in that negotiation from that point going forward. And I'll give an example of it. I won't name names, but I was, in the last year I was in negotiation with somebody in, the company that was buying a company we were involved in. And the corp dev person literally lied. And we caught that person in a lie. And we confronted that person, and they acknowledged the lie. And from that point forward, there was no trust in the negotiation. It was very difficult because anything that person brought up, we simply didn't trust. And our strategy from that point forward in that negotiation was a simple one, which is that we just simply said, well, this is our position, and we're happy to compromise when you compromise, but we're not going to simply compromise because you say, well, this is how it has to be. And it ended up being a very, very tense and very difficult negotiation for something that probably shouldn't have been tense and difficult. And it got done, and it was fine, but it was much harder than it needed to be. So that's piece number one. Piece number two is you'll often feel in a negotiation like you have to respond. Like the ball's in your court to respond. And one of the most powerful tactics that you can use in a negotiation is to let time pass. It's oftentimes really, really hard. But a lot of times the other side, especially if they're buying your company or they're investing in your company, they don't feel the same sense of urgency you feel. And so they're willing to let time pass just to see what you come back with. And it's very difficult as the person who feels a sense of urgency to let a little more time pass, but it's very powerful rather than continue to respond and try to get closure on every last point, and drive to the end point. Sometimes just to let a little bit of time pass and see what happens.
Okay. How do you guys do the due diligence when you've decided to invest? What is the information or the docs founders have to prepare? Thus, how long does this process take going for Series A investment?
It varies dramatically from venture firm to venture firm. So, like the conversation we had the other day, don't view VCs as a generic. We talk about this in the book plenty, right? There's lots of different archetypes and lots of different styles of firms. There are some firms who write, 100-page internal deal memo, and then there are other firms like us who do no internal documentation around diligence documentation around the deals we do. You have some firms that have you come in, even after they've got, you theoretically agreed on something, that still have you come in and present to all of their partnership And then you have other firms like us who don't ever really have a formal partner presentation, but instead have each of the partners interact with the company over the course of our own diligence. For us at Foundry, our diligence tends to be done up until the point that we decide to make an offer for a company. So our diligence is something we're doing all along the way. Once we've agreed and have agreed on a term sheet with a company, we rarely have any diligence other than the formal legal diligence that our lawyers typically do as part of the actual transaction. So our diligence process is, I would say, pretty straightforward. We do internally, each of the four partners spends time with the company, we use the products, we do lots of checking of the people through the network that we have and the people that we know. We typically expose the companies we're looking at to the companies we've invested in, and we ask a lot of the entrepreneurs we work closely with to spend time with the entrepreneurs. It actually lets the entrepreneurs do diligence on us as well as us do diligence on them through people that we've worked with. But that's part of our evaluation process of deciding whether or not we want to make an investment. Once we get to that term sheet point, it's usually 30 days to get the deal closed because the lawyers have to do the documentation, and that's just how long it takes. We've closed investments as quickly as 15 days, and sometimes it takes 45 days. But the actual formalization of the diligence there is very straightforward and is mostly handled by lawyers.
Okay. Brad's been talking about sharing a number of posts, but we did get someone saying, can you please share that post? So if you would let us know again what post you're talking about. Brad is going to share several posts, I think, after we're done, done with this Hangout. So I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
The three I've got listed so far is an NDA post, a post on VP of People, and the example from the Moz financing where we invested $18 million, sort of going through in great detail how that financing went down.
Also, I think I sent you an email. If you want to look at, I think it's called capography, and it's a way to put cap tables together that was sort of interesting. One of the students was asking me about it at the forum. So if you have a chance to take a look at that.
When I get caught up in my email, I'll take a look and get that.
Next question. Let's assume in the seed round an option pool was set at 10%. Now Series A investors want to increase the option pool to 20%. Who gets diluted then? Solely the founders or also the seed investors and or other key employees if they got any options?
Yeah, so recognize that the option pool expansion is just part of the negotiation of price. And typically in any round, your new investors are going to look at what existing unissued options exist and increase the pool to some amount between 10 and 20% of unissued options. When I say it's negotiation on price, there's really two places where the option pool expansion happens. It either happens in the pre-money valuation or it happens in the post-money valuation. If it happens in the pre-money valuation, let's take simple numbers so that I can explain what's actually going on. Let's assume that your pre-money valuation is $10 million. But you have a 10% option pool already in the cap table, but you've issued 100% of it. You've issued all 10% of the options. So you really have no unissued options available. That new investor asks you for a 20% pool that's unissued because you're going to grow and add a lot of people, and they want that 20% pool to be pre-money. In that case, the dilution is going to hit everybody except the new investor. So essentially the 20% of the options really lowers your pre-money valuation to $8 million, right? 20% of it goes to the options. The $8 million is your pre-money, and then whatever money comes in on top of it. Let's say that you're raising $5 million. You would get $5 million on top at a $10 million pre. So the new investor gets 5 out of 15, or 33% of the company. But the dilution is the 33% plus the 20% that goes to the option pool, so that when the round is finished, you have 20% in the option pool. The post-money approach would be a situation where everybody gets diluted, including the new investor. So the pre-money stays at 10, but you get $5 million. of new capital, and then after all the dust settles, another 20% of the company is issued to created this unallocated option pool. So your effective post money in that case, instead of being 15, it's not quite, but it looks around 17 million, a little bit higher. So the math can be tricky, but recognize that really what that new investor is asking is, we need some options to grant to employees as we grow through this next round. And you have some leverage over how much that is. If of the 10% that you created in the seed round, you still have 5% left, and the investor's asking for a total of 20, you're only granting 15% of new options, not 20% of new options. If you think 20% is too much, in other words, now we probably have enough leadership people, we probably only need 10% before we go to the next round, you could argue instead of a 20% option pool increase, a 10% option pool increase. But it all rolls through and impacts your pre-money and your price per share.
I noticed we did run out of time. Can you take one more question, or do you need to run?
My phone's going to ring any second, but one more question.
Okay. From an investor perspective, how would you rank a signed letter of intent by a big name reference client, basically saying, you guys rock, the product you're building is truly disruptive?
It's okay. I would count them as a customer where they're sending you money is a lot more interesting. So I think it's easy for a name brand customer to sign a letter that says, we think you're great. It's a whole nother level of value if they're actually sending you money to use your product.
All right, great.
The punchline is I don't value it very high, but it's better than nothing, and I would use it as a way in the exploration to talk to that customer and say, so why do you like this product? What's exciting about it to you?
Okay, great. Brad, thanks for joining us, and so glad that you're feeling okay.
Thanks.
You will be back with us on the 28th. I'll actually be in Ireland at the Kaufman Fellows Program Summit, but we'll plan on seeing you on the 28th to talk more about venture deals.
Okay, sounds good, everybody. See you soon.
Bye-bye.